Wellesley College is an institution that's in Massachusetts. It's where Hillary Clinton went to college in 1964 and 1965. At the commencement exercises that they practice every year, they sing America the Beautiful. In the last few years, it has become really a mess of singing, because when they come to the line, crown thy good with brotherhood, the all-female college wants to shout out sisterhood. But that's not good enough, because many of them are trans people, and so they're calling out siblinghood, and some of them are calling out brotherhood. So in all the mess of confusion, no one knows exactly what's being sung in America the Beautiful. Confusion on the face of the deep. One young lady registered as a woman in Wellesley College, and she registered as a woman, but then she became a trans person, and she wanted to be called Timothy. They wanted people to call her Timothy. When she applied for a job on campus, they said, no, we can't take you. You're a trans person, but you're a white male identifying that way, and we have to have more diversity. We're just confused back and forth continually. Last month, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, had a big discussion about what is a woman. And one man, a lay member so-called, asked the question, what is a woman? Do we have at the Anglican Church an official definition? And one of the presiding bishops made this statement: there is no official definition, which reflects the fact that until fairly recently, definitions of this kind were thought to be self-evident as reflected by the marriage liturgy. But the Living Love and Faith Project, however, has begun to explore the marriage complexities associated with gender identity, and points to the need for additional care and thought to be given in understanding our commonalities and differences as people made in the image of God. Then it goes on to say, the LLF, that's Living in Love Fellowship initiative, began in 2020 with the goal of enabling the Church of England churches across the country to participate in the process of learning and praying together as part of discerning a way forward in relation to matters of identity, sexuality, relationships, and marriage. So the Church of England doesn't know what a woman is, but rest assured they're working on it. And that's what's going on in our country. A Lutheran preacher, woman preacher, there's problematic right there, by the name of Nadia Bolz-Weber, writes a book called Sexual Revolution, and she's a popular writer in the Lutheran Fellowship. She says she wants to reconstruct the moral architecture surrounding sexuality. So much double speak, isn't it? But that is not something over there on the other side of things. We've had problems right here in our own fellowship. Oklahoma Christian University in Oklahoma City has had the same type of a problem. 2 years ago, there was an uproar on campus by some of the students to take N.B. Hardeman's name off of one of the buildings. And the reason was because someone had gone back and found that Brother Foye Wallace had written a statement in the 1930s pertaining to Brother Hardeman, in which Brother Wallace went to visit Brother Hardeman with some black preacher students with him. And Brother Hardeman met them behind the tent after the meeting was over. And because of that episode in history, some of the students says, I just can't worship in a building that has N.B. Hardeman's name on it. And they overcame the faculty and overcame the staff and the administration and took his name off the building at Oklahoma Christian University. Regardless of the fact that Brother Hardeman had done more for black churches than almost any preacher in his generation, it was he who had preached continually in black churches right there next to Freed-Hardeman University in Henderson, Tennessee. It was he who built up the black churches all in Tennessee. It was he who had gone preaching without pay to these churches. It was he who had introduced Marshall Keeble, the famous black preacher, to the campus of Freed-Hardeman College, but that doesn't matter at all. We're interested in this, and we're so sensitive to, we've got to take his name off the building. So the question is, what really is occurring in America? We're being swept up in a movement here that is a woke movement. And people are unaware of what's really occurring in America. And we're changing words. Even the word woke is a word that's not really a legitimate word. It's just the changing up and dysfunctioning of a word, awake. But it's more than that. It's really an attack upon the culture of America. I remind you that the word culture comes from the word cult. In the olden days, the word cult simply meant religion, not necessarily a negative connotation. Every country is founded upon religious presuppositions. That's what makes a culture a culture. We have a culture, and it's founded upon religious, Christian presuppositions. That's a Christian culture. And this is an attack against the culture. And so what we're seeing is a revoking of Genesis 1:27. God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he made them. Male and female, he made them. No longer. We don't have any male and female any longer. We're revoking science. Science is simply experimentation, hypotheses, drawing conclusions that are warranted by physical evidence. Physical evidence. But on college campuses, they're saying that's a function of white patriarchy, white social customs, science. One man by the name of Gad Saad, G-A-D-S-A-A-D is his last name, writes a book, and I'll mention him some in this series of lessons. He tells us that the liberal arts colleges, I want you to know, the liberal arts colleges, and he's a professor there, he said they're cesspools of intellectual garbage any longer. That's what's happening. And that's what's occurring. So science is cast out too because it's a white colonial way of thinking. Logic is cast out the door because logic is drawing conclusions that are warranted by evidence. But no longer are we interested in logic. We're interested in power, and we're interested in overcoming the opposition with power and with the fist clenched. That's the idea. It has even gone so far, we're rewriting history, revoking history, tearing down monuments, tearing down statues, rewriting history books. That's what's going on in the public school system all across the country. Rewriting history, revoking what really history teaches. I'm reminded of a statement by Richard Evans. He writes a book in the Third Reich, and he talks about, of course, Nazi Germany. He says, we need to remember that the past is a different country and they do things differently there. I wonder if our brethren are ready to get rid of Philemon's name out of the Bible. Philemon was a slave owner, and Paul wrote to him, and he sent it by the hands of Onesimus, his slave, back to Philemon. Are we going to take his name off of buildings too? Are we going to quit talking about the Apostle Paul? Are we going to quit honoring Apostle Paul? Because he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18 and following, listen carefully to what he had to say about slavery. He said, were you called in circumcision? Be not uncircumcised. Were you called in uncircumcision? Become not circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God. Let each man abide in the calling wherein he was called. Were you called being a slave? Care not for it. Nay, even if you can be free, use it rather. In other words, even if the opportunity to be free presents itself, that's not your goal. Your goal is use it rather for Christ. Are we going to remove Paul's name off of buildings at Christian colleges because he made such comments regarding slavery and wrote to Philemon, who was one of his brothers at Colossae, who was a slave owner? No, to be sure, slavery was eradicated by Christianity, but it was the principles of Christianity that have been taught from the bottom up as hearts one by one were changed and a culture changed. But Christianity does not eradicate slavery or any other institution with which we're put out that we don't like by raising our fist, carrying placards, and destroying a culture and fracturing it all the way across the board. The same thing we're seeing right now in corporate America. Corporate America is now big, the giant corporations, almost all of them now, whether it be Coca-Cola, BlackRock, Walmart, Amazon, all of them. They're not interested in shareholders. What's a shareholder? That's someone who invests in their company, right? They're not interested in that. The word now is what? Not shareholder, but what? Stakeholder. Who said that? Right there with us. Yes, sir. Stakeholder. Stakeholders. What's a stakeholder? So everybody in society, it means they're going to be green with their energy. They're going to put money into green energy. They're not interested in making money for the shareholders. That's of course, simply the facade that they're putting out. They're interested in equity, inclusion, and hiring people of different colors in order that they might have this politically correct nonsense going on. We're not about shareholders. It's about stakeholders, and everybody in society is a stakeholder, whether you own stock in Walmart or not. That's what's happening in America. And society is being turned upside down because of that very thing. But my main concern, and incidentally, before I get off of that soapbox there, all of that is so much hypocrisy anyway. Walmart will go have inclusion classes and equity classes, but they get all of their goods from slave labor in China. They're paid $1 an hour, $2 an hour, and they work 17 hours a day. The same thing with Amazon. Amazon will have classes on equity and inclusion, talk about having black people and brown people and everybody in it, but yet when blacks recently complained about what the workplace was like in Amazon, they fired them immediately. It's all a facade. But this is what's happening in America. But my concern is, as we watch our culture be overturned or crumble from the foundation up, that Christians are unprepared for it. And that's the reason for this series of lessons. The woman from whom I draw the entire name for this entire series, I should say, she makes the point, her name is Noel Marion, and she makes the point, she says, Christians, and she uses that in a broad sense. Christians, number one, are cowards. Cowards. We're not confronting the culture. We're not making confrontation. That doesn't mean ugliness, but we're not confronting the culture at all. And she says, I find that to be the case across the board. I'm reminded of the passage in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, where John says, perfect love casts out fear, but we're cowards, many of us are, cowards and fearful about what's taking place. Not only so, but we have been put to sleep at the wheel. We're asleep. And one of the passages we need to remember for this series, where Paul writes in Ephesians 5 and 14, awake, thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall shine upon thee. In that very text, he was talking about heathenism and its impact upon Christians and the ideals and ideas of heathenism and the doctrines of heathenism that were making an impact upon Christian minds. And he tells us, verse 6, if you back up, that's Ephesians 5 and 14, but if you back up to verse 6, you'll see, let no one deceive you with empty arguments. And then verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. But now, traditionally, we've stopped right there. But what does the next line say? But rather even reprove them. You give an answer, you reprove, you correct them. And then he tells us in verse 14, quit being asleep at the wheel. Awake thou that sleepest. That is, quit being in this mental, spiritual lethargy and awaken to what's happening. And that was in the first century. It's happening today also. Thou that sleepest, arise from the dead, and Christ shall shine upon thee. So what happens? Many Christians are asleep. We're busy with ball games. We're busy with television. We're busy with entertainment. We're busy with schools. We're busy with our own projects. And we're not seeing really what's happening around us. I hear an advertisement on the radio frequently about one guy, I don't know which company he represents, and it just came to me. He said, you know, I talk to many people who are in investment firms and in the investment business, investment corporations. But you know how many of them have read even one? He said none of them have read even one book on investing. Not one. Yet they're in investments. How is that the case? Now I'm going to say there are many Christians, not only unfamiliar with the Bible, but we haven't read one book on what's happening in the country. We haven't read anything. We're unfamiliar with what's actually occurring in America. But even more than that, we are commanded, number 3, not to be ignorant of Satan's devices. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11, he says that no advantage be gained over us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his devices. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 10, one of my favorites, where Paul basically tells us what? He tells us that we're to tear down reasonings, that is the idea there, the reasonings, the principles, the arguments that people make on the other side. He said, you better tear those down. In other words, we need to be assertive, aggressive, if we can use that word, in answering the culture. But what we're failing to do frequently is do that very thing, answer it because we're not familiar with it. But something else perhaps that we can bone up on and improve on, and that is learning the principles of the Bible. What are the basic principles of the Bible? I mentioned in class a few moments ago that Brother Rex Turner made the statement. He was one who founded Alabama Christian School of Religion, and that was back in the late 50s, early 60s. He said, I would rather be knowledgeable in a wide sweep of the Bible and a wide knowledge of the Bible and the principles of God than to be an expert in one book. And too frequently we become experts, or we spend time in one particular book, but we need to have a wide scope of history, biblical history, and God's principles that He's laid out. And let's look at those principles, one of them this morning, and that is natural law. I want to go back to Massachusetts, 1761, and the town of Boston. And there was a trial. It was February, cold that year. At the State House in Boston, there was a trial that was occurring. And at issue, what was called the writs of assistance. Now, what were writs? The writs of assistance were open-ended search warrants that were given by the king or the king's ambassadors to the colonies, that they would give their king's men an open-ended search warrant that they could search your ship, your warehouse, your house, your saddlebags, your person, at any time, anywhere. No one had to go to a judge and say, I think that Bill Lockwood has thus and so contraband on him. They gave open-ended search warrants, and so they could, at any time in the night, knock on the door, go through your house, destroy all your goodies, searching for things. What were they searching for? Contraband. What kind of contraband were they searching for? Tea, not fentanyl, tea, and molasses from which they made rum. And all of that was legitimate. That was sold in the colonies, and it was even shipped to the colonies. But what happened was that the King of England said, I don't like the fact that some of you colonists are shipping it on your own shipping companies, and so we're going to say you have to use an English ship to carry the goods. And immediately, by a stroke of the pen, they outlawed men such as John Hancock, who had his own shipping company that was shipping molasses and tea into the Boston Harbor. So now the writs of assistance came about, and it was an egregious affront to the rights of freeborn Englishmen and the rights of individuals given by God. They asked, it was at the State House, the trial is taking place, now they come to the climax of the trial. They had asked a man by the name of James Otis. Boy, he was a brilliant man to represent the king's, be the king's attorney. James Otis had entered Harvard College at 14 years of age. That was back when Harvard had a classical education, not a woke education. And he had entered at 14 years of age. Now, think about that. What kind of education are these boys receiving at home? They had to know Hebrew and Greek and Latin. They had to have read all the classics or many of the classics. 14 years of age. He was a brilliant mind. They wanted him to represent the king, be the king's attorney. He said, no, I'm going to represent the colonists. There were a bunch of merchants in Boston said, no, we want James Otis, and we would like to sue the king's men, all of the king's horses and king's men, to get this rectified. So they chose, that is, the king's men chose Jeremiah Gridley. There's an English name for you, Jeremiah Gridley. And the man who was helping James Otis, his assistant at the table, was a man by the name of Oxenbridge Thatcher. So there's a name I haven't seen recently, Oxenbridge Thatcher. So Oxenbridge Thatcher and James Otis the lead. And so here's how the argument went. Jeremiah Gridley, the king's attorney, made the point. He said, we recognize that the writs of assistance are onerous and tedious to colonists, and they are distasteful to them. However, in order to have law and order, because the king has said this and Parliament has passed this law, we must abide by the writs of assistance, and that is law and order. Now, that was basically his argument. Now, James Otis, the historian who writes about it, from whom I gather the information, A.J. Linguth, in his book Patriots, the men who started the American Revolution, says this. He says, when James Otis stood up to speak, something profound changed in America. But I'm going to let John Adams who was present there as a young attorney. Remember, 1761, he's just a young guy, wet behind the ears. He wanted to hear this senior lawyer, James Otis, work. And he was sitting in the audience, and John Adams is going to tell us. He said, when James Otis stood up to speak, it was like a flame of fire in the hall. He argued, and he had a broad breadth of knowledge. He argued from Edward Coke's compendium on the laws. It's spelled Coke, but it's pronounced Cook. Edward Coke's compendium on the laws, that the rights of freeborn Englishmen can never be violated, and it is the duty of judges to cancel, to nullify laws that go against the rights of freeborn Englishmen. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's exactly where we are today in a lot of places. The judge's duty to cancel and nullify the laws that violate, number one, the British Constitution and the rights of freeborn Englishmen. And the writs of assistance do so. And he showed that by Edward Coke's law. But he went even higher than that, and he soared right now into the clouds. And he said this: every man is born in a state of nature. And nature is how God made him, how his Maker made him. And every man has right to his life, his liberty, and his property. And no man can remove those justly without incurring the wrath of Almighty God. And furthermore, he goes on to point out that the king's men had continued to violate these, and it meant the following: that these natural rights, natural law, takes precedence even over the success of the kingdom. Now that meant something, because he was saying we have a right to eradicate a government that violates the natural law rights of men. And that's what we should do. And he goes on to say, pointing at Jeremiah Gridley, he said, because you have violated the natural law, natural rights of men that God has given men, it cost one king his head and another man his throne. That was almost a veiled threat, wasn't it? That started a firestorm in all of the colonies. Natural law. I want you to notice also one of the most famous commentators on the law at that time was William Blackstone. Our founding fathers loved to read William Blackstone. They loved to read John Locke, Baron von Montesquieu, the Frenchman. But here's what William Blackstone had to say in regards to natural law. When the Supreme Being formed the universe, he organized it and then impressed certain principles upon that matter from which it could never depart and without which it would cease to be. He even used the illustration of God putting his thumbprint upon the heart of man. We have natural law, that is, natural instincts that tell us there are some things right and some things that are wrong. God pressed those upon our hearts, and you cannot escape that at all. Then he goes on to say this: upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, two laws, law of nature and law of revelation, depend all human laws. And that's to say, no human law should be suffered or allowed to contradict these two laws. Now, let me stop here. Where do they get this information? Where do they get these ideas? Natural law. They got them from the Bible. That's where. This is biblical teaching. I want you to look at these passages, two of them very quickly. Romans 1, 26 and 27, and Romans 2, 12 through 16. I want you to see exactly what Paul has to say in Romans chapter 1. Here he's talking about the Gentile, non-Jewish world and the downfall of that Jewish world. 3 times he uses the phrase, God gave them up. And in verse 26, here's how he words it. Now, I want you to read it carefully. I want to read it together. Give you a moment to go there. For this cause, that is non-Jewish world now, God gave them up unto vile passions. For their women changed the natural, there's that word, natural use into that which is against nature. What does that mean? What's nature? The word in the Greek is phusis. It means God's created order. He's not talking about non-Jews who somehow violated the law of Moses. God's created order that God put on your heart. So the women changed the natural use unto that which is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men working unseemliness and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error which was due. It was against nature. And he's speaking about homosexuality is against nature, against natural law. That's amazing, isn't it? He's not talking about the fact that they violated the law of Moses. He's speaking about non-Jewish Gentile world. Now let's go to chapter 2, beginning in verse 12. We'll start at verse 11, where he tells us that God is no respecter of persons. Then he tells us this in verse 12. For as many as have sinned without the law, and who are they? Shall perish without the law. That would be Gentiles. He's kind of giving you a summary of what he said so far. As many have sinned without the law, that is, without the law of Moses, because he's been talking about Jews now, shall perish without the law. Now you might ask the question, why will Gentiles, non-Jews, who have never read the law of Moses, perish? Why would they be damned? He's going to go on to tell you how it's the case. They shall perish without the law. Then he tells us, and likewise, this is continuing verse 12, as many as have sinned under the law, that is Jews, shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Now he wants to go back, and he's going to pick up that first line. As many as have sinned without the law shall perish without the law. Without the law of Moses. Why would that be the case? And listen to this. For when the Gentiles do by nature the things of the law, these not having the law, that's the law of Moses, are a law unto themselves in that they show the work of the law written on their hearts, their thoughts one with another, accusing or excusing them in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. What did he say? He said that the non-Jewish world who have not the law of God have a law of God on their hearts. It's written right here. That's what Blackstone was talking about when he says they have the thumbprint of God on their heart, and men are responsible before God to that natural law at least. And Blackstone would point out, and do you know, all the way until the time of Abraham Lincoln, lawyers carried William Blackstone with him. And his statement was that our human institutions need to be based on these two laws. Remember that statement, the law of nature and the law of God, the revelation. Law of nature and the law of revelation. What's he talking about? The Bible. The Bible. That's exactly what our founding fathers believed. That's exactly how they crafted this country. Now with that in the background, I want you to think about some things now as we proceed along the way. There is today a huge, what is called woke movement, as of course we're talking about in the title of the lesson. And what exactly is wokeness? What is wokeness? It is to be sensitive to all of the supposed oppressions that have occurred to your group, your person, now and all the way into the past. It's to group you into groups, and you're to be hypersensitive to all the ideas or supposed oppressions that have occurred to you. And your goal now is I put D-I-E, but it's D-E-I or D-I-E, die, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Now, what is that all about? Well, here's an example. When Joe Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson, or Jackson Brown, no, I think it's Brown Jackson, appointed her. You heard the phone call, it was on the news. He called her, he said this, we need a Supreme Court justice that looks like America. What does that have to do with jurisprudence? Looks like America. This is what we're all about now. What we look like, and what it looks like to the board, and what it looks like to Americans. That's what wokeness is all about. And it's setting aside whether someone is qualified for a position or not. We're about diversity. And companies and corporations are about diversity. So they'll appoint women on the board who may have no experience at all, so they can say, I've got a woman on the board. They go plant trees in Harlem, such as many corporations, BlackRock had done this, go plant trees in Harlem supposedly. They show up in their silk suits, and they don't plant anything, and they look like they're just taking pictures in Harlem, so they look like they're being diverse, equity, and inclusion. Then they go back into the posh offices. Nothing's done. It's all smokescreen. That's what this wokeness is all about. Let's just dig into it just a little bit deeper. I want to use the Apostle Paul, for example. The Apostle Paul, arrested, remember, about the year 60 in Jerusalem, taken to Caesarea, and then finally up to Rome, and he was there a prisoner for the cause of Jesus Christ. Wokeness is about racism, makes you part of a group. The goal is to remake society by fracturing it. It has spiritual roots. We'll talk about that more in future lessons, and we'll look at the tactics. So let's see what it's all about here. And we're going to use the Apostle Paul for an illustration. Paul has been arrested. Paul's in Caesarea. And who arrested him? Well, he was arrested because the Jews demanded it, but he was arrested by the Romans. And he was taken to a Roman prison. So Paul is all about saying, you know what? This is anti-Semitism. This is anti-Semitic. I'm here because I'm a Jew. And Jews have been oppressed. Had they been oppressed? Yes, they had. They were going to be oppressed some more. And so Paul is all about, I'm a Jew, I'm a part of this group, Judaism, and that's because, that's the reason that I'm oppressed. That's the reason I'm in prison right now. That's what Paul's to think. That's how he's to think about it. I'll get this fixed in a moment. My ears are too little, I guess. I don't know. So he's a part of a group. He's not to be thinking about himself individually. He's to be thinking about the oppression. So not only so, but he wants to remake society because he sees that the Jews, his fellow Jews, and he talks about them in Romans chapter 9, his fellow Jews, he says, my heart's desire is for them that they may be saved. He's interested in them, but he's not interested only in that they'll be saved individually. He's interested because they need to quit being oppressed. And so he writes a letter from the Birmingham jail. I mean the Roman prison. And he writes this letter and says, look here, our goal is to remake society, and we need to get some people here together, and we need to get all the people that are Jewish preachers with me, and we need to make some noise around here because we're all Jews, and we've been persecuted because of that. And we need to be hypersensitive to the fact that it's Judaism they're after. And you can go back and read, by the way, in Roman history, they had a lot of anti-Semitic statements. Indeed, they had a lot of anti-Semitic statements. You can read them. They're available to anybody who wants to look at them. As a matter of fact, the Romans hated the Jews. You see it in the book of Acts. You see it also in secular history. So Paul's he's on the right track here. So he says we need to remake society. And you do that by getting a large group of people, putting a wedge together, and start fracturing society. I can't go outside my prison, Paul will say, but I want you to get out there, and I want you to raise your fist and talk about the anti-Semitic Roman government. And that's what we're doing here. It has spiritual roots. That is, there's an idea regarding it. It's just like the snake in the garden. You shall be as gods. You will remake society. You can remake society. You'll be as gods. And Paul's caught up in this, but he says we got to have these tactics. And so what are the tactics? We're going to have struggle sessions in the prison, and we'll get Timothy in here. Timothy is going to whine about the fact that he had to be circumcised at one point, and that was because this this pro-Judaism at that point, an anti-Gentile movement that was going on, and he had to be a Jew somehow to get into the synagogue, and that's all that's bothered him. And he's got to have these struggle sessions all of his life. He's got to go through it all the way till he's 40 and 50 years old, and it never resolves it. Sounds like what we have in the homosexual movement right today, isn't it? They continue to have struggle sessions and consciousness-raising sessions. What are consciousness-raising sessions? To make you aware that you're persecuted because of these things, and here's how your people have been persecuted in the past. Remember, you're part of a group, and this is how it's been for you people in the past. This is the way it's going to go for you now. So Timothy's got to sit in the jail cell with Paul. He's going to have to cry about the fact that he had to be circumcised to get into a Jewish synagogue. And how terrible are the Jews for not letting the visitor in, and all that kind of thing. And then he's going to get other people together. That's the tactics they're going to use. Now that's what's going on in our country. And that's what's happening with people in the churches of Christ. Preachers are involved in this nonsense. That's what's going on. And we're unable to see that below all of it, that's just the tip of the iceberg, below all of it is Marxism. Marxism will start from the bottom square up. Classical Marxism began with atheism. Karl Marx's followers had a league of militant atheists. Atheism is at the root of it. Communists would say, Marxists would say, you don't have to be an atheist to be a Marxist, to come into the Marxist movement, but you will become it. You'll become an atheist because there is no God in Marx's idea. None whatsoever. He raged against God. And that's what Marxism is all about. If one does not understand that, he doesn't understand Marxism. Number two, it's a class struggle. This is classical Marxism. Class struggle, that is the bourgeoisie, that is the owners over here, the proletariat over here, and we're just fracturing society because they don't deserve to have all the properties and the monies and all these workers in the factories, and so we're going to get them to rise up and fracture society and cause upheavals in society because of it. So that's class struggle. And abolition of private property. That was one of the keystones of it, wasn't it? Because private property given you by God, gone completely. Nothing that belongs to you, period. And then violence. I was talking to a friend of mine. He is a friend, but he's an atheist at school, and he was lauding Karl Marx. And I said, have you read Karl Marx? Oh yeah, I've read Karl Marx. I said, well, he called for violence. Violence. He said, oh, no, that was Vladimir Lenin. Those are the guys that came later. I said, no, the Communist Manifesto that Marx wrote called for the upheaval of society, destruction of society in so many words. What are you talking about? What's happening is they've gone to these colleges that are teaching intellectual garbage and want to defend the Karl Marxes of the world. That's what's happening. That's just amazing to me. But in the 1960s, Marxism kind of started dragging down, started stalling a little bit. So they said, we're going to have to revamp it, put on a new dress. And so it's neo-Marxism. What is neo-Marxism? It is the woke movement. So instead of dividing society between the landowners or the business owners or the shop owners or the factory owners and then the factory workers and the people that were simply living hand to mouth over here, bourgeoisie, proletariat, instead of dividing it up that way, we're going to divide it along natural fissures, race and gender. And we're going to rub it raw and irritate everybody in the minority class to make them angry and angrier and angrier at white major society. And that's what's happening, isn't it? It's exactly what's happening. So it's cultural. That is, it aims at Christianity. We'll see that in a moment. It's racial, that is to say that they divided up on races. Their goal has always been to divide the races entirely. Sexual, same thing, men and women, gender. And critical theory. Critical theory has replaced simple logic, science. It's critical theory. What is all of this? Socialism, that's what it is. Karl Marx said that he was a scientific socialist. Just as a flavor of it, at Occidental College, where Barack Obama went to school, supposedly, the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice, they have a whole department on this. Whole department on it. This is what's going on in colleges. Right here in MSU probably has the same type of thing. And here's what they state on their website. Look at this. They teach Marxism, psychoanalysis, the Frankfurt School, we'll talk about that next week, Lord willing, deconstruction, critical race studies, queer theory, feminist theory, post-colonial theory. There's not an education. That's brainwashing. That's Marxism through and through. But all in all, and in the end, always remember this, it is an attack against God and God's authority. It's a war against God. That's what's happening in our country now. It's a war against God, from the campuses to the media to corporations, warring against Almighty God. And too many Christians are caught up in it. They don't like, number one, the authority of Christ. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and teach all nations. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. They don't like the authority of Christ. They don't want Christ in the authority position at all. Number two, it's all against individual responsibility. You're going to be a part of a group. You're part of an elderly group. You're part of a young person's group. You're part of a group of white people. You're part of a group of black people. You're part of a group of brown-skinned people. You're part of a group, and you're to think in group terms. What does the Bible teach? We must all stand before the judgment bar of God and give an account of how we have lived. Each one, 2 Corinthians 5 and 10, and give an account of how we have done, whether it be good or bad. Each individual, each one. But individualism is gone. They want you to think in terms of group think. And then finally, it is socialism. Basically, socialism is all that boils down to. I want you to note this. This is from Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, in their 2002 book. And I want you to hear carefully what they say regarding socialism. Socialism is not only the labor question, but first of all questions is atheism. The question of the modern embodiment of atheism, the question of the Tower of Babel built precisely without God. Not to go from earth to heaven, but to bring heaven down to earth. That's what socialism is. It's an atheistic movement that is on an advanced course to destroy Christians, Christianity, and the churches. And we need to be awakened to what is going on in our society and pick up the armament of God, know the Bible, and be able to defend the truth. And let us not be fearful at what repercussions may come, because remember, perfect love casts out fear. 1 John 4 and 18. If you've not been faithful, we're just going to offer the invitation very quickly. It's an opportunity, simply by our tradition, that you can come to the front. We will pray with you, pray for you, that you might be restored to the Lord's fellowship. If you've not been a faithful Christian, if you're not a Christian by faith, repentance, baptism into Christ, you can become right now a New Testament Christian. We want you to come right now while we stand and sing.